Right. Welcome to the this evening's meeting. My name is David Posner. I'm the IET Sussex Events Secretary. Right, let me introduce Rebecca. And I'm afraid I didn't memorise her name. If I organise this properly, it's sitting at the top of the screen. Rebecca Posner is a behavioural psychologist and researcher who specialises in transport and future mobility. Having worked across academic, private and public sector, she has led flagship programmes in research, including the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers contribution to the Department of the Transport's programme of Human Factors and Behavioural Change Research in relation to connected and automated vehicles. Here she led the largest UK study on public perceptions and expectations of automated vehicles, and the first ever study to monitor real-time responses to automated vehicle use. Her work has directly shaped the Automated Vehicle Act, BSI standards, national and international transport strategies, and industry's best practice for design and implementation of transport systems that are safe and inclusive by design. I'm very impressed. So here's a slightly different view on requirements for automated vehicles. Normally we think of automated vehicles, how do we make them safe, how do we stop them having accidents? Different view, perspective from the people who are using the automated vehicles.
Brilliant. Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Rebecca Posner. As said, I'm a behavioural psychologist. I am currently the Director of Research within the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers, where I work as part of the National Centre for Accessible Transport, and I was previously the Head of Social and Behavioural Research within the UK Government's Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, where I led the programmes of behavioural science and then social research and human factors. So my roles has always been around understanding transport user behaviour and user requirements, and then understanding how we build those into the design of transport systems and technologies to make sure that they actually solve real-world problems and challenges. My focus for today is going to be on providing an alternative approach to how we design and implement automated vehicles. One that is focused more on building solutions directly with the public to enable public acceptability and uptake. And my dad has been on the receiving end of this quite a few times about the difference between public acceptability and public acceptance, but I use the term public acceptability really intentionally. Public acceptability is when we build a system that is worthy of people's trust, because we've designed a system that understands the user requirements directly into it, so there is no need to convince people of the value of that system. Public acceptance, on the other hand, is when we design a system and a solution and we expect people to use it regardless of what that solution is. So on the first one, we've built a system with people that is worthy of that trust. The second one is when we try to convince people to use a system regardless of what that solution is. I also thought it was worth bringing two assumptions right up at the front that are often part of the public discourse that are probably worth myth-busting quite early on. And the first one is that there is an assumption that people understand, and by people I mean the general public, but also industry who would be users of future automated services, that they understand intrinsically the potential benefits of automation. That's not the case. Until we spend time really engaging with people about the potential benefits of automated vehicles, there is not a clear sort of societal-wide understanding about what the potential benefits of these technologies are. The second aspect is, from research that we've done, it is very clear that the public do not want autonomy for autonomy's sake. They only want automated vehicles and automated transport services if there is a clear purpose and if they are working actively to address the societal challenges that we face today. Otherwise, there is no demand for them. So, when it comes to transport, there's always two ways to approach a problem. There's the technology-led or a human-centered-led approach. In the technology-led approach, we tend to frame the solution as purely technical. So how do we ensure that a vehicle can drive safely from A to B without the need for human intervention? Here we prioritize, we don't really think about the why we're doing it, we focus on the how we're going to do it. We focus on functionality over usability. And this is often driven by an assumption that if solution works, people will want to use it. Going back to that first assumption I made, that's not how decision-making works. That's not how people choose a mode of transport over another. The alternative approach is the human-centred one. Here we explore more of a societal outcome and we explore how we build a solution to address that outcome. So that first question is, how do we build a transport system that is inclusive, safe and sustainable by design? Too often in transport, and really particularly when it comes to transport technologies and automated vehicles, we end up building a really, really complex solution and then trying to find a problem that it fixes. I'll just use old-fashioned technique. There we go. You might ask yourself why that matters, why it's important. Well, when we take a technology-first approach, the focus, as I said, is on getting the technology to work. But with that, you tend to have low public awareness of self-driving vehicles. Currently, across the UK, we've not seen significant shifts in public understanding, public perceptions of technology at a national level. And that's because we've kind of focused on just getting the technology to work, as opposed to understand why we want it to work. We then also see that the case studies are really driven by industry and business priorities. And what that means is reduced trust, reduced willingness to use, and ultimately reduced uptake. And that has an impact on our ability to unlock any of the societal and economic benefits or impacts that these technologies could have. On the other hand, when we take a human-centred approach, effectively we're focusing on understanding and designing systems for users that directly solve societal problems because we've taken the time to understand what they may be. The use cases and service design is therefore driven by user needs, and what that means is greater public acceptability, increased user trust, and increased willingness to use, ultimately helping us to achieve those societal and economic impacts, which is often why we're driving this. So instead of building a solution and finding a problem to fix it, we understand the problem and we build a solution to address that. So that's where I thought I would start this evening, with a bit of an overview of the big challenges that we're currently facing across our transport systems and the ones that we need to resolve. Roughly, there's a lot of problems in our transport systems, but roughly you can group these into three categories: safety, sustainability, and accessibility. So if we start with safety, in 2024, there was 1,602 people who were killed and 27,685 who were seriously injured on GB roads. That's one person every 18 minutes. And when we delve into the factors that contribute to these collisions, approximately 52% have driver behaviour or inexperience as a contributing factor, 34% have distraction or driver impairment as a factor, and most deaths happen on rural roads, with 60% of those killed in road collisions currently happening on rural roads. It's also important to us when we think about safety to look at safety in the broadest sense. So it's not just road safety, but it's perceptions and feelings of safety in general, as well as personal safety. So if we look at, for instance, the safety of women and girls on transport, currently about 9 in 10 women feel unsafe walking at night. Only 16% of women report feeling safe all the time on public transport. There's been a significant increases in the number of assaults against women and girls reported on rail. And increasingly, we're seeing rates of women feeling unsafe travelling alone, cycling alone, and that difference between genders is significantly increasing year on year. And whilst these may just feel like a list of stats, what that actually means and the real world impacts is reduced journeys overall, complete avoidance of certain modes of transport, increased journey time, so avoiding certain routes, and increased financial costs just to ensure safety. We then look at accessibility within and the sort of the interdependency between safety and accessibility, and we look at the fact that disabled pedestrians are at significantly higher risk of collisions than non-disabled pedestrians. And that is as a result of a transport system that is effectively not designed for people. The inaccessibility of transport infrastructure, paired with people having to move into shared spaces, means that increasingly they're put at risk of collisions with motorised vehicles, for instance, because of a failure of our transport system to be inclusive by design. If we look at sustainability, transport consistently remains the highest emitter of greenhouse gases, and the UK government has made a range of different commitments over the years towards transport decarbonisation. Around, for instance, increasing the proportion of zero-emission vehicles on our road, reducing the overall number of vehicles that are manufactured, reducing multi-vehicle ownership, reducing number of miles driven, reducing single occupancy journeys, and increasing proportion of journeys made by sustainable transport. So that's public transport, walking, wheeling and cycling, and active travel in general. We then move on to accessibility. So currently there are 16.8 million disabled people in the UK. That's about 25% of the UK population. And disabled people are make significantly fewer journeys than non-disabled people, on average about 29% fewer journeys. The barriers to transport are systemic, which means they're widespread, they're across every mode, every part of the transport system and every part of the journey. Whether that's inaccessible infrastructure, poor inconsistent service provision, inadequate information, as well as the attitudes of other road users, or transport users, should I say. Beyond physical and digital accessibility, affordability of transport is also a growing issue with, I'm sure you're all aware of increases in fuel, but also we've seen increases in rail and bus fares, as well as the cost of being able to access accessible devices for active travel, for instance. What we're increasingly seeing is that people are cutting the number of journeys that they're making due to rising costs. And whilst you might say, well, that helps us with the goals to sustainability, these are essential journeys that people are making. And what it's actually leading to is increased social isolation, reduced access to transport, to employment and education. We also have a fundamental issue around the availability or access to transport and a growing divide between urban and rural transport provision. The decline of bus services, for instance, hitting rural areas the hardest, leading to greater dependency and reliance on the private car, which is often a mode that is not available to every single household. And equally, you might have the most accessible vehicle, for instance, but if it's not deployed in an area, then it's not an accessible transport system. This is the environment in which we currently find ourselves. And that's the big picture that as I go through today and talk about the different user requirements, this is what we need to remember the context in which we're operating in. Currently, we are in a position where the technological solutions that are being built aren't addressing the societal problems or meeting diverse user requirements. However, when we engage with the public meaningfully to understand their experiences, there is a really clear demand for automated vehicles, and there's a range of ways through which they believe that these technologies can be direct solutions to the existing transport challenges that we face today. But if we look at the current advancements in automated vehicles, the technological priorities and the use cases and so on, the big questions that are being asked don't match those user requirements. So that's going to be what I focus on today. It's going to be outlining what the public think automated vehicles can help, how they think they can help, and as well as those user requirements to make sure that the actual solutions that we're building meet those user requirements and demand. So the first thing I'll say is try and get a little bit of audience participation so that I don't lose everyone so early on in the conversation. When I say automated vehicle, what is the first vehicle that comes to mind? Car, did you say, Sarah? Any other suggestions?
Automatic mini buses.
Mini buses, brilliant. Anything else?
Driverless trains.
I didn't hear that, sorry. Oh,
Driverless trains.
driverless trains, brilliant. So we've got cars, mini buses. Anybody else agree car? Show of hands, or nods of heads. Okay, brilliant. So when we asked this question to a nationwide program, through a nationwide program of research, this is the most common design that came up. So for those of you who can see, it is effectively, oh, I'm standing, sorry, I'll go over here. This is the most common design that came up, which was a minibus. It was a shuttle. It was, in this instance, a 20 to 25 seater, but with flexible seating arrangements. It was something that expanded current public transport services, integrated within the public transport provision, accessible by design, safe for everyone. So not necessarily, unless you go and have a look at what's being deployed in the streets of Hamburg currently across Germany, not necessarily the most common, or in some use cases in northern Norway. This is not necessarily the type of vehicle that you will see or think about when you say automated vehicles, apart from the gentleman in the front row who said minibuses. So, but this is generally when we ask the public, this is what they expect and what they want from automated vehicles. So today I'm going to talk through 5 core areas around user requirements. I'll start with the use cases that the public expect. I'll then talk about user requirements across vehicle, service and infrastructure design. I'll talk about the importance of equity and inclusivity as a guiding principle within the design of these systems. And then finally, really critically, and something where there's a lot of solutions that could be built, but it's something that's not being explored yet, is actually information and communication requirements. So when we look at use cases, When we talk to the public and we engage with them, there's sort of 4 core use cases that members of the public think automated vehicles can really help to address the challenges that we face today. The first one, and this was pretty clear and unanimous regardless of where you go across the country, it's expected that it will be public transport or shared transport services integrated within the current public transport offer, with the focus on improving and enhancing the offering of public transport services today. There's an idea that they go with effectively improving connections, especially in rural areas, between remote villages and key transport or community hubs. So whether that is, for instance, I'll take the example of Alnwick in Northumberland, where we did some research last year, where currently there is a really high reliance on private taxi use from school children because there's no public transport services between the rural villages and the main bus station. So currently what you have is at peak times a fleet of private taxi services with 1 child in each vehicle that is taking a child from a remote village to effectively Alnwick train station. The use case there was actually if you had a shuttle service that operated between the villages at peak times to match that user demand, that would then be able to take them directly to either the rail station or to a bus station, there would be really high uptake. And not only would it help to improve access to education, it would reduce that very, very congested line of traffic on the single A road between Alnwick and Newcastle. So one of the examples there around that integration within public transport. Along with that, there's a real demand and priority for a focus on rural areas and underserved areas first. In areas which are what we would call transport rich, especially big urban environments, that's not where people see the priority use case. It is around integrating and improving the connectivity between suburban and urban environments, for instance, but particularly in rural areas or where there are limited options available to people, encouraging them away from private vehicle use or dependency on the private car. We then look at campus and event-based transport. So across, for instance, biomedical campuses, I'm based in Cambridge, so we've got the Addenbrooke's campus, the biomedical campus up there, huge site where they've removed private cars, but there's no alternative modes of transport across that site. So it's a massive site between sort of major hospitals and also offices and lab space. To move around the campus, they're looking at introducing automated vehicles there. That's one example of where you can effectively remove the need for the private car without impacting the accessibility of that environment. The other is around events. So for instance, if you've got major events around football matches or concerts or the new theme park that's being introduced around, home counties. I can't remember exactly which county it's coming into, but linking between public transport and major hubs so that people don't have to rely on private car and there is an accessible, reliable service there. And then really importantly, first and last mile, particularly looking at the role of logistics here. So looking at how, I don't know if any of you have ever seen sort of Starship, which is one of the companies that's been operating really heavily across the UK, but the little delivery robots effectively that do that first, last mile. They had a brilliant partnership. They still do with the co-op and they're sort of trialling across the country. So those aspects there where they can help facilitate access to products and services. We then move on to vehicle design. So probably as you can see from the image that was drawn from our participants from our previous research programs, there is a real expectation that automated vehicles help to address the existing transport barriers that are present in the fleet of vehicles today. People don't see the value of just retrofitting sensors and AI technology on vehicles because if you just taking an existing vehicle and putting the highest suite of sensors on it doesn't instinctively make it wheelchair accessible. It doesn't address the fact that there is only one wheelchair space on buses and that there is a competing priority between parents with a pram and a wheelchair user. So just simply using the existing fleet of vehicles and retrofitting technology on it doesn't actually address any of the challenges that we face today. It sustains them, and as I'll talk about in a second, actually introduces a wealth of new ones. So it's really about redesigning, not retrofitting, and thinking how automated vehicles could be an opportunity to address the challenges that are present in the existing fleet of vehicles. Accessible by design. There is an expectation in line with what I've just said that these new vehicles will be completely accessible end-to-end throughout the journey, from automated ramps and door controls because the remover of the human driver removes that ability to sort of provide that assistance. Level access, priority spaces, intuitive and independent use. If there is no longer any human support present in the vehicle, all of that needs to be replicated in another form, and there is an expectation that that will be built into vehicle design. Human-machine interfaces and visibility, and bear with me, this is one of my favourite findings from a project I've ever done, which is actually the importance of clear line of sight and visibility with the surrounding environment. We mentioned that one of the projects that we did was the first ever study to look at real-time responses in automated vehicle use. And what we did there was through the use of EEG, which is effectively brainwave monitoring to measure physiological responses. What we found was that when particularly women didn't have clear line of sight out of a vehicle, so there wasn't an ability for them to get the level of contextual information required to understand why a vehicle was behaving in a certain way, we saw spikes in stress and anxiety and distress that remained throughout the rest of the journey. When they could see out of the vehicle, particularly clear line of sight out front, which could explain why a vehicle had stopped and so on, we saw that spike immediately reduce because they were able to gain the level of context and situal information that was required for them to feel safe in that vehicle. So there's an expectation that whilst we think about the importance of privacy and so on with blackout windows and whatever else it might be, or different designs, actually that line of sight is really important to make sure that these vehicles are inclusive by design. And then obviously with the removal of the driver, there's an aspect, an anticipation that there will be an increase in human-machine interaction and interfaces built into the design, into the vehicle, so making sure that those are fully accessible. So if it is a touch screen, ensuring that it provides feedback in an alternative format, because for anyone who's in that vehicle who has a visual impairment, a touchscreen is not going to be in any way accessible for them to use. Any feature that is required for safety should be built into the vehicle by design. So looking at CCTV, emergency buttons to contact emergency services in the event of a collision or an incident, and then an expectation that maximum speed limits will be built into the vehicles as well. And then finally, touching back upon the point I said around the design retrofit, the idea of adaptable seating arrangements, to be able to adapt, for a vehicle to be able to adapt to different user requirements when they're using those devices, whether that be wheelchairs, medical devices, personal mobility devices such as cycles, e-scooters and so on, as well as assistance dogs, and being able to adapt the cab inside to do so. Advancements we're already seeing existing fleets of buses, but extended beyond that within new forms of automated vehicles. When it comes to service design, interestingly, this is actually one of the areas where there's been the least amount of research done. The focus has often been around the vehicle, human-machine interaction with the vehicle, pedestrian interaction, and so on. When it comes to service design, it's often been one of the areas that has been forgotten. There's increasing work going on at the moment, but it's one of the areas we have the fewest answers and where there's the greatest possibility around technological solutions coming in here to address these challenges. What we do know is that all users must be able to use the services safely and independently, including any emergency tasks. End-to-end accessibility throughout the entire journey is expected, and I'll delve into that in a little bit more around what that means, but a journey doesn't start the moment a person gets into a vehicle. A journey starts the point at which they start planning that journey. So every aspect from the journey planning all the way through to arrival has to be inclusive, both physically and digitally. Remote monitoring and operation is expected to be maintained in early rollout phases. Now, I know that this one is an interesting one because in the world of automated vehicles, remote monitoring and operation is often seen as a failure of the system. Actually, it's a really, really great opportunity to ensure, to enable confidence and trust in use. There was an expectation from the public in the early days that there will be a level of remote operation and supervision to address any issues in terms of emergencies as people become more familiar with that. So that remote operation and monitoring is actually a critical enabler to public trust and shouldn't just be seen as a sort of technological failure of the system not being able to operate functionally. One of the use cases or the benefits that is often talked about when it comes to automated vehicle is the possibility for them to extend the provision of public transport services beyond sort of outside of hours, so nighttime services and so on. However, with that in mind, I think there's a slightly alternative way of thinking about this, which is how can we ensure that human-driven vehicles and automated vehicles are used in a complementary way. And by that, I mean, actually, the removal of the human driver at night introduces a range of safety concerns and safety risks, particularly for women, but also for disabled people. And so with that in mind, there was actually a suggestion that, yes, automated vehicles could be used to extend the services, but actually there should be a removal of the human driver during the day and moving to shift work with human presence being available on nighttime services to ensure perceptions of safety. There has to be integration with emergency services and rapid response plans in place. Again, if we go back to the removal of the driver, there is an expectation that within the services there will be direct links built in and mechanisms to be able to communicate directly with the relevant emergency services should they need to be involved. And then finally, replicating the 66 non-driving roles that drivers of passenger services currently undertake. So a couple of years ago, myself and some colleagues at the Transport Research Laboratory did a study looking at mapping out all of the non-driving relating tasks that a driver of passenger services currently undertakes. When we talk about passenger services, we mean taxis, private hires, bus, coach. And what we did was effectively map those out to identify that all of those need to be replicated for that service to be viable. It's a really great report, highly encourage you to go and read it. But with that in mind, we could sort of group those into four categories. The first one was around providing information. So currently, drivers tend to listen and respond to passenger questions. They recognise and respond, inform passengers of route changes or delays. And they communicate and enforce rules and requirements whilst the service is operational. We then look at service quality. So they're responsible for admitting or refusing passengers and explaining the reasons for doing so. They're responsible for cleanliness of the vehicle and gathering any lost property, as well as ticketing and ensuring because the removal of the driver, how does that interaction happen? How is the payment made? How do you ensure that that payment is made? Not necessarily something that everyone thinks about when you think about automated bus services, for instance. They then look at physical access, so assistance boarding or exiting a vehicle, recognising and responding to people hailing a vehicle, and recognising and responding to passenger requirements such as requiring the use of a ramp, for instance. And then really importantly, safety, which we've already started to touch upon, but a key aspect of any driver is managing vehicle capacity. How do we ensure that the vehicle isn't at overcapacity and that information is shared clearly with people who are waiting for a service, for instance? Ensuring passengers and goods are seated, secured or steady before the vehicle departs. Recognising and responding to distress or risks. Deterring antisocial behaviour. Ensuring priority spaces are made available when required. And managing the safe evacuation of the vehicle. These are all aspects of a service that needs to be replicated within automated passenger services. And then when we look at infrastructure design, so firstly, there is an expectation that automated vehicles will integrate within the existing infrastructure and with that account for its inaccessibility. So I mentioned beforehand there is a wealth of barriers at the moment within transport infrastructure. There is an expectation that there isn't going to be a huge uphaul of all of the roads and transport infrastructure in the UK today. Therefore, automated vehicles must be able to adapt to what we currently have and address those flaws that are there in our infrastructure. There is a suggestion in the early days that we explore segregated routes to enhance quality of service. So for instance, allowing automated passenger services that are integrated within public transport to be able to use bus lanes, for instance, or tram lanes, should they be designed to do so safely. The other suggestion, and this is something that's been explored for a while, is looking at automated vehicles as a way. Someone mentioned automated trains. There is an interesting exploration around how whether or not automated vehicles could be used to replace and reverse some of the impacts of the beaching cuts that happened in the 60s when a lot of the local rail journeys were stopped. But the infrastructure is still there. So I don't necessarily mean the rail infrastructure, but the segregated routes are there. And whether or not there's an ability to repurpose that infrastructure to actually allow for automated vehicles to replace those systems, much reduced cost in terms of infrastructure management when you don't have the rail infrastructure and the requirements around that maintenance. Stop design, whether this be bus stops or any kind of ride-hailing services, how to hail a vehicle. If the vehicle is automated, how does a person both hail that vehicle or know that the vehicle has acknowledged that they have hailed that vehicle? Is there changes to the bus stop infrastructure, for instance, that's required to replicate that process? How to confirm where the vehicle will stop? Is there a need to place a position within a bus stop, for instance, in an area which is a waiting point for the people know that that is where the vehicle stops and where they are expected to wait? how to verify that the correct service is available. These are all aspects that could be considered and built into the infrastructure design. And then finally, resilience. There is an expectation that there's going to be that cybersecurity and cyber resilience is required from the start. That is an expectation from the public around public trust, but also that the physical and digital infrastructure is going to be built and tested for resilience prior to deployment. So, not altogether surprising given my job titles and where I currently work, but equitable and inclusive access is one of those priority requirements. It's a fundamental requirement that anyone has said has to be built into automated vehicles. And when we talk about equitable and inclusive access, I often frame this around inclusivity and the sort of 3 A's around accessible, affordable, and available. So when we talk about accessibility, what we actually mean is end-to-end physical and digital accessibility. So from journey planning, booking, ticketing, hailing, vehicle identification, in-journey tasks, emergency tasks, off-boarding and onward journey. All of those aspects need to be completely accessible for anyone using them because we are removing any potential human support to that service. Information and communication must also be accessible to all, and I'll touch upon that in my next slide. Services must be affordable. Currently, when people think about automated vehicles, cold, without any kind of prompting, we tend to get the response that we got earlier, which is cars, and particularly private vehicles. And there's an expectation that these are gadgets, these are experiences. This is not something that people are going to be able to, that the general public is going to be able to use, own and use, sorry. Therefore, we need to ensure that that's where the priority is on public transport. So we need to make sure that services are affordable to all, otherwise we are creating greater divides, and going back to the challenges that I presented at the start, we're worsening those as opposed to resolving them. Subsidisation of fares through service, consideration around subsidisation of fares through service level pricing. So for instance, around demand management, if there's an area where there is, in urban environments with a higher rate, if you can raise that slightly to be able to enable access to rural areas or in areas of social deprivation or where there's greater levels of lower socioeconomic households. Integration within existing concession fares was also considered as really important, particularly if it's embedded within public transport services. And then there's a real need for grants and funding to enable those early deployments in rural areas as well. And then finally, available. So deployments must be across diverse geographic areas, prioritising transport deserts. So there's areas where currently there's not that many transport options available. The journeys must match user demand, so there's a really important role around fleet management there. How do we make sure that the vehicle's in the right place at the right time? And then finally, there is, as I mentioned earlier, the potential for them to improve access to goods by introducing automated logistics is another one in there as well. Communication. Communication and education is seen as a sort of like foundational pillar for any kind of public trust and user acceptability. Getting caught over my own language and terminology, user acceptability. When we talk about communication requirements, there's two things here. There's formats and there's content. So when it comes to formats, all of the information must be available in a range of formats. So audio, visual, haptic, and it must be compatible with assistive technologies. And that is end to end. So from that journey planning all the way through to offboarding the vehicle, payments, and so on. All essential information must be available within the vehicle or the built environment. So if there's any information that is critical to use, so for instance, emergency protocols, how to open a vehicle, all of those things there, they have to be present within the system. They cannot rely on the use of personal devices. Otherwise, we are excluding people by design. And equally, they can't rely on connectivity, if we go back to the point around rural services. Or we need to significantly improve the reliability of our connectivity across the UK, whichever is easiest to do. And they must always offer a non-digital alternative. Education is absolutely essential to build public trust, and that requires diverse forms of user engagements. And I could talk for another 40 minutes about that, so if there's any questions on that, on how to do that, please just let me know. When it comes to the specific information, so we can sort of group this into 6 categories. Firstly, there is journey-specific information, so booking, ticketing, current position, journey routes, next stops, disruptions or delays, and that information needs to be made available to people. Any user requirements or regulations, so any relevant restrictions or regulations to be adhered to, and that needs to be shared prior to the journey and whilst and in the journey, in the vehicle as well. Accessibility features, so any clear guidance on how to access or use accessibility features or request assistance. Safety and emergency protocol information, sorry. So protocols for responding in the event of an emergency, how to contact information, remote supervision, operators or emergency services. That all needs to be clearly outlined in both prior to journey and within the vehicle. Boarding and alighting, as I mentioned beforehand, where to wait for a vehicle, how to hail it, all of those aspects there. And then finally, and really importantly, and something that's often forgotten about, is closing the loop, which is the feedback and confirmation. So if someone has requested a stop, if someone has requested, whether that is outside of the vehicle, inside the vehicle, has tried to make contact with an operator, either for a general question or for an emergency, there has to be a feedback mechanism that demonstrates that that has been received to enable that public trust. So, what next? I've spent a lot of time listing a lot of the user requirements and all the knowledge that we have based on the research that we've done with members of the public. And what that goes to show is that there is a huge level of demand for automated vehicles, but not in the way that we're necessarily thinking about it today. And what that means is that we're not necessarily asking the right questions and we're not necessarily building the right solutions. When we take a user-centered approach, it leads to significant and long-lasting changes in attitudes and perceptions. Acceptability and trust increases, as well as willingness to use and share the roads with automated vehicles. And when we design for and with people, that road to uptake, slight pun intended, is significantly simplified, allowing us to resolve the societal problems that need addressing. There was a huge list of requirements that I provided, hopefully that will open up for discussion. But what we found is that many of these problems that we've uncovered through user-centered approaches don't yet have solutions. But they can be resolved with technical solutions, but only if we ask the right questions. The requirement now when we look at automated vehicles is converting these user requirements into product requirements, and then that's how we make sure that the solutions that we're building actually address the end user needs. So with that in mind, I will open up the floor to questions, and thank you very much, and hopefully that's given some food for thought to everyone.
I'd like to thank Rebecca for the presentation. Questions? Has anybody got some questions? Yes.
Can you throw some light on the key performance indicators of this project where you can decide whether the experiment is successful and meets its aims?
Do you mean in terms of how we determine that human-centered? Yeah, actually, here's one I prepared earlier, just in case. So I thought I'd pull out some of the stats that we did around the impact that taking that human-centered approach had. So through that project that we did, which was a longitudinal evaluation, so it was a project with multiple parts in it. So firstly, we were looking to assess and evaluate the effectiveness of different types of mechanisms on changing attitudes and perceptions towards automated vehicles, as well as increasing willingness to use and trust, but also looking at which types of language, communication, or methods of engagement were the most impactful, as well as that, and understanding those user requirements. So when we did this approach, when we did the program, what we found was that 60% of our participants, and this was sustained, so this was not at project end, this was sustained at a year after project end, 60% reported feeling safer about being in or around self-driving vehicles compared to a baseline. So it was higher immediately afterwards, but it's a sustained aspect that we're looking at. 71% felt less worried about being about self-driving vehicles in general, and 50% felt more confident about their ability to handle unexpected situations. That was particularly when we demonstrated how the technology works and demonstrated how the vehicles detect hazards and other users in the environment. Comfort using and sharing the road significantly increased, and then was sustained at 6 months and then at a year. We significantly increased willingness to use. People were more likely to believe that self-driving vehicles could make local transport systems better when they were integrated and deployed in a way that matched those user requirements, and a significant increase in those thinking that there were many more advantages to self-driving vehicles, which was again sustained at 6 months and 1 year. So through that project, what we did was not only did we spend the time understanding what those user requirements there. But then we went and deployed vehicles that matched those user requirements in terms of the use cases that we did in those in 3 different areas across the country. So that was the outputs of this project there. We fit into the design, the requirements that they had in terms of the information, but also, and I don't have data on it yet because it's not published, but I will do soon, is around when we've replicated this methodologies in other parts of the UK, we're seeing the exact same patterns happen compared to projects when we look at it at a national level. If we use that as our comparator, where there's not been that level of engagement, we've not seen significant changes in attitudes and perceptions towards automated vehicles. So yeah, glad I slotted that one in. But yeah.
Yeah, go on.
How can you deal with with an automated vehicle, the situation of an unexpected thing happening, you know, a crash, 2 or 3 vehicles ahead, or something like that. So, would it be possible to have built-in strategies, or does it actually require communication back to some control centre, you know, to tell the vehicle what to do?
So I think if it's about the vehicle-to-vehicle communication, then that depends on a couple of things. Firstly, the integration between the vehicle and the infrastructure and the level of communication that there is there. If it's vehicles that are, so say it's 2 automated vehicles, they are able to communicate with each other in most fleets. That's been inbuilt, is my understanding. But in terms of informing non-automated vehicles that there has been a collision, it will require this, at the moment, it will require the same forms of communication as if a human-driven vehicle has broken down. But that's one of the aspects where actually the connectivity could help to make that communication instant. For instance, feeding back to, say, national highways if it was on the motorway or any other kind of... but at the moment, it would require the same processes. So it would feed that back in immediately to the remote operators, but then and then if there is a agreed communication process between that remote operator, and then that would be done at that level. But there's not anything currently built to enable that immediate communication that I know of. But yeah.
Okay. There's another sort of related thing that a lot of these vehicles, you know, when the decision is being made to take a particular route, the automated taxis. There was a report in the paper today that, in fact, some taxis from their GPS system were told a road was a through road, but then it had been pedestrianised by a bollard being put up, and they drove down to the bollard, and then the vehicles had to reverse all the way back. And for safety, they had a very loud klaxon, which woke up the whole street of people on the way.
Is that the one in Santa Monica in the US? No, absolutely. And so that is when we currently have the issue of latency, when people are relying on mapping and routes that are based with, and then there's not those updates. So I think we've all been taken down the one-way route when Google Maps or other digital wayfinding tools that may be available in the market has taken down a route that they think is a road and it's not. And currently, automated vehicles are effectively rely on those same systems unless they can have enough data out there to be able to collect that information in real time. There's a lot of partnerships going on at the moment between, I know, Google and Department for Transport have just announced around improving the integration and sort of update of road status, I guess, in terms of improving the speed at which that is integrated within mapping, particularly around bus and open bus data. That was one of the things that was announced recently. But equally, there is a requirement, and this is where the manufacturers, the automated vehicle manufacturers or developers often put the blame on the local authorities because they have the responsibility to update through the relevant databases when there are changes to the infrastructure. So they say that they can only do it as based on the data that's available. But there is a broader question, which is why, again, other wayfinding apps are available. But this was why Waze, for instance, was such a success when it first came out, because it relied on crowdsourcing. And so there's a lot of work going on at the moment around how that could be fueled into the likes of Google Maps and other platforms, but also how do we ensure the validity of it? Because I don't know if anyone saw this, maybe not everyone spends their time reading through transport anecdotal news, but years ago in Berlin, I think, where someone had bought a bunch of phones and had put them in a trolley and was going up and down one of the main routes in Berlin to sort of make it look like it was really high density traffic because of all the phones, and effectively the way that it's sort because of the way that it's mapped. So effectively rerouted all of the peak time traffic in Berlin off other routes because they managed to sort of trick the system. So the technology is developing all the time, but there's a lot of those things there where until we kind of have that integration across physical, digital, and kind of the ability to have as many open source data sets as possible that can be embedded into it, and particularly looking at the development of those data sets that can be plugged in as opposed to the development of a range of different apps. So I think that's where we've kind of got the critical issue at the moment, is that the data isn't updating as quickly as you need it, and when you don't have the ability to sort of a human driver who could maybe a little bit closer detect. And there is a question as to why, I will not say which vehicle manufacturer that was, even though I think we all know which one it was, why it took them to get right to the bollard to determine that that was no longer a route that was available. That's an interesting question for those data engineers to answer, and the software engineers to answer, sorry. But more broadly, there was also an interesting aspect in there, which was it was following the law. So it was following the requirement that if a vehicle is reversing for accessibility purposes, you have to have an auditory cue to inform visually impaired pedestrians and other road users. So it was following that, so, which is why they then woke everyone up in, I think it was Santa Monica at 2 o'clock in the morning in that process. And so there was an interesting aspect there, which was where did the system, it was a system failure, but when you look at it in terms of all of the aspects, why that had happened was because it was following the letter of the law. The law hadn't specified that actually that's not necessarily a use case where that's required, but because it's automated, it was doing it instinctively. The update, the data around the physical environment hadn't been updated in real time. So it's an interesting edge case, actually. I find that one. So yeah, of course.
Just regarding those figures,
Yeah.
they were sustained. Was there any drop-off?
In terms of, so yeah, so the sustained at 6 months. So these percentages are the 6 month basis. And then they've been at the 1 year basis. I think if I look at, I'm just remembering off the top of my head because we reran the data quite recently and that bit's not been published in the 1 year evaluation, but it's looking, there was a kind of drop of about 1 to 2 percentage points across those. There wasn't a significant drop across, so it was quite significantly sustained across all of those measures. We did the greatest drop, but again, it was still significant differences from pre to 6 months, was at the immediate post to the 6 months was when we saw that kind of great, and actually it was driven by more people going to find out about the technology. And the really interesting aspect with that, what we found for this project, was at the start of it, we had really high levels of claimed knowledge. And by the end of it, actually, we saw that the claimed knowledge had significantly reduced because people understood more about the technology, and therefore what was really interesting was at the beginning everyone saw it as a gimmick, as a gadget, and by the end they started seeing it as an actual mode of transport, which is why we saw those changes. Because with all due respect to buses, but I don't think everyone's generally hyper excited about the idea. I mean, some people are, please don't get me wrong, but you don't tend to get really enthusiastic about the idea of a day-to-day bus journey. And so what we need to also do is change the perceptions away from these being a one-time experience towards an actual mode of transport. So that kind of explained why we saw those changes. People had a much more accurate understanding of the technology, and that helped to manage and balance expectations. Does that answer the question?
Yes. So
Yes.
So from initial to 6 months,
Yeah.
that drop-off was...
I'd have to go back and check. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I'll go and check. It was, I think it was within the, it depended on the metric, but it was between 0 and 5 percentage points generally on average between the two, but I'll go back and double check, and I can let you know. So yeah.
Another question then. You mentioned that the beaching cuts,
Yeah.
some of those routes are still in it. How common is it that those routes are still available that haven't been built on?
Quite significant because of the cost of removing the rail infrastructure, for instance, is that there's huge cost with that. So often you tend to have abandoned railway lines effectively. So more often than not. And so there was some suggestions and ideas around how actually if you removed that infrastructure, but you kept, so the actual rail lines effectively, but use that same infrastructure to enable faster sort of busway style journeys effectively, that could be a really good early use case of automated vehicles because it would reduce the interaction between other vehicles and therefore from a passenger experience and perception has also reduces concerns there.
I thought most of the track was ripped up.
I don't think so. So some areas were in some regions, but actually there's a lot of track that's still there. But also where the actual, so that if the track was left, the space was not reused, if that makes sense. Sorry, there's still a ditch, for lack of a better term, effectively, where some of that rail infrastructure was, and it hasn't always been repurposed for alternative uses because there was always an idea that they might reopen those lines at some point in time. So, yeah.
Yeah, Dave. Sorry, no, the guy behind, sorry, in the black t-shirt, yeah.
Thanks very much. There was a lot in there.
Yes.
Hopefully we can access those slides.
I assume so.
A little bit of.
Well, if you're happy to share the
Yeah,
slides, then we're
absolutely,
happy
of
to
course, yeah.
I'm interested that you appear to have the ear of legislators or something. How much of this do you feel is going to be considered
Yeah.
when we start to
It's a great question. So a lot of the user requirements in the kind of, so some of the aspects around safety and the service design have fed directly into the automated passenger service licensing scheme that was announced 2 weeks ago. And so a lot of those requirements in terms of end-to-end accessibility, what that looks like in terms of requirements to be built into that. And the reporting requirements for the licensing will be, so when operators want to operate a service, they will need to apply for a licensing, for a permit to operate the vehicle under that, under a certain license, whether that is in a taxi style service or in a public transport. That will then be reviewed by DVSA, who will be the ones that sort of in partnership with a local authority that is relevant to that area.
How about
The bigger picture
of making this not, as you said,
Yeah.
a gadget in the city,
Yeah.
but in rural areas, in starved,
Yeah.
normal
Yeah.
accessibility? Who's going to drive that? Who's going to have that vision?
So that's a very timely question at the moment because for multiple reasons, I'm sure everyone's noticed the number of announcements that have been made of various organisations in taxi-style vehicles that have come into London, and that London is currently termed as the battleground for automated passenger services between Wave, Waymo, Uber, Bolt, and Einride and some of the other ones. There has been, so up until about 3 months ago, CCAV, which was Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, was a joint unit, so it was joint between Department for Transport and Business and Trade, which meant that the societal and industry potential benefits were looked at together, and so there was a requirement for a certain number of trials, for instance, to be done across rural areas and so on. So there was a lot of work. There's trials happening in Orkney, for instance, at the moment around automated passenger services up there. There's a lot going on around, so it's not necessarily as much rural, but across Newcastle and Sunderland and up in that area there's a lot happening in the West Midlands. So R&D funding from a UK government perspective has been quite geographically widespread in terms of the funding there. But at the moment, as R&D is starting to sort of reduce because there is commitments towards commercialisation, and at some point in time, government has to stop pumping money into R&D. What we're seeing is commitments that they will be done, but no current evidence as of yet around the diversity of. But a lot of the local authorities are now currently taking up the mantle on that perspective. And actually, the local authorities are probably the ones that have the biggest potential impact over where trials are happening, because they are the ones that determine what services are used on their road. And so what we're seeing is actually a really, really proactive group of local authorities that are coming together to share those lessons learned across predominantly, it's certainly outside of London, still predominantly in the south, although having said that, Transport for Greater Manchester Transport for the West Mids and across Newcastle, Sunderland area are really, really active, and there's some brilliant work happening across Edinburgh, Glasgow, Orkney, and more in Belfast as well. So there's quite a good mix, but now it's being led far more by the local authorities who want to see how this can be integrated within their services, because that's where there's clearly the demand for it. So the shift has moved a little bit from national government, who is now focused a lot more on the regulation, to local authorities who are leading the way a bit more on implementation. Yeah.
It would seem to me that many of the requirements that we've been talking about apply to manually operated systems.
Yeah.
So is there any progress in trying to get those requirements through into the sort of existing modes of transport?
Yes and no is the answer to that question. I think that there are some, we've seen some significant advancements, particularly around bus and rail in information provision. There's a lot of work going on at the moment around bus services, particularly bus stop design, standardisation of that. A lot of work that's been going on around accessible infrastructure and what are the levers that can be pulled there to sort of like enable that. Some of the most recent advancements we've seen in public transport, particularly buses, is around the legislation that came in last year before, around the need for visual and audio information to be provided on all buses. So all new fleets of vehicle have to have that built in, and then the sort of retrofitting of that. And there's a lot that's been going on in rail. It's mainly done quite in a localised way at the moment, a lot of pilot schemes. So there's been some brilliant work happening up north around the integration of BSL, for instance, on passenger information boards at railway stations and sort of expanding the pilots there. So there's a lot of it that is happening. I think the expectation, there's advancements that are happening, let's put it that way, sorry, let me caveat that. But I think the expectation is that seeing as these systems are going to be new and not currently being designed, there's an opportunity to get them right from the start, whilst on the other ones we're retrofitting infrastructure sometimes that is very hard and highly costly to do so. But there is a challenge, and it goes back to the sort of systems approach that discussed earlier, which is there's a bit of a chicken and egg at the moment with the automated vehicle space, which is the operators are saying that the reason that the vehicles aren't accessible is because the manufacturers aren't building vehicles that meet user requirements. But the manufacturers are clearly laying out that until there is enough demand from an operator to be able to justify that level of order, it is not worth them. It's a too high of a risk to build completely novel vehicles without outside of sort of like prototypes and trials and so on. So that at the moment Europe have done this a little bit better, I have to say, in terms of how the funding has been programmed for the last round of funding, where there's been commitments within that you had to have different parties and sort of commitment if around purchasing fleet size if they could demonstrate that there was demand for that service. So there's some really interesting stuff happening there. In the UK, that's where we're sort of seeing the issue. But to your question around progress in some areas, but not as the fact that the transport accessibility gap hasn't really reduced. And that actually there was a report that came out last year by the Transport Select Committee that said that transport accessibility now is worse than it was in 2018 when the Inclusive Transport Strategy came out. Kind of gives us a bit of evidence that actually it's not as good as it could be. But there's been quite a lot of funding recently that's been announced around improving some of those, and some suggestions that was, for instance, the renationalisation of railway, that there are opportunities there to sort of deploy things nationally as opposed to being operator driven, which, because the differences in systems across each operator also introduces a range of barriers. So we'll wait and see, I think, but we'll keep doing it. But we'll wait and see around the improvements to the services at the moment. Yeah.
What's the estimated date when we'll actually see a live one?
I was wondering when that question would come up. So technically, there are automated vehicles that are operational on roads at the moment within the boundaries of trials. So not to be biased towards Cambridge, but if you go up to Cambridge, there's currently trials happening at the moment. They have a safety driver on board. That's because it's a requirement under the Code of Practice. But as of next year, when the Automated Vehicle Act comes into force, then there won't be that need for that safety driver anymore. The automated passenger servicing, the licensing scheme that has now come in, so technically now an operator could apply for that scheme. If they get the permit, they are allowed to operate without the need for that safety driver. The expectation, I think at the moment, Waymo are the ones who are most likely to be the first ones to operate an actual a fully operational service, and they're currently saying at the moment second half of 2026. So there could be, yeah, but it's I don't know if anyone has had much work with government, but it's a bit like sort of governmental spring, which we don't really know what those months necessarily mean, but they sort of mean between March and July. So yeah, but there is the expectation, and currently that is what Waymo is working to, that they will have vehicles that are operational by the end of this year.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
Is there much international coordination with this work and setting a standard?
Yes, there is actually, which is probably a really lovely way actually in the sector, which there's a lot of work that has happened at the UNEC, so at that UN level, and the European Commission around standardisation, because of the realisation that no manufacturer or operator is ever going to want to operate in one country, and therefore they want to be able to adhere to the same standards. So there's a lot of actually ISO standards that have already been put through around, particularly around the system, operational design domains, how those are set. Again, looking back to our partners on the other side of the channel, the European Commission have been doing a lot of work. They've actually funded programs for international corridors, so to be able to explore how you could have highways not in like a motorway sense, but connected corridors that go across European countries, to be able to understand what the impacts would be on like sovereignty and data security and all of those things there. There's a lot of work going on in that space, but yeah, more than we would think, which is quite nice actually for once. So yeah.
Actually, you answered a bit of a question on it. This is what you told us about the UK.
Yeah.
What's it like in other countries?
Yeah.
Is it more used in, say, the United States or?
Yeah, so the US is on a slightly different playing field because the way that it is set up there is on a state-by-state basis as opposed to a national play. So if you look at it from a regulatory sense, the UK is the furthest ahead. The UK is the only one that's actually got a full regulatory framework for deployment of automated vehicles. When you look at deployment and user uptake, the US is further ahead because of the way that they've been doing it in cities by cities. It tends to still be trials and closed, but it's operational services that are running and fair paying, fair charging, and there's no safety operator or human driver or what's the word? Safety operator on board, yeah. But they are limiting who can use the services to sort of like a pre-selected group of individuals who feed back into the design of the system. But that, I think, again, looking, Waymo is probably the one that's the most advanced. I think they're across 14 cities now in the US. In North America and generally, so we extend that to Canada, there's a lot of stuff happening up there around more logistics, so long distance haulage, for instance. There's been some things going on there for quite a while. And then if we look across to Europe, Europe tend to be, they were a little bit delayed just in the way that the funding happens and the fact that the Horizon Europe fundings were the sequencing of it, but now they're absolutely, yeah, they're really starting to do some really great work. Switzerland in particular at the moment, I think, are one to watch. There's some really great stuff happening in Norway, particularly on an accessibility perspective. Norway are really leading the way there. But across Europe, they're really looking at the integration. To the question around who's sort of driving these use cases, Europe have really been really clear around the integration of these as passenger services and as alternative to shared forms of transport. That was a really critical aspect that they had around the sort of broader sustainability goals. So you've still got the likes of the private hire vehicles that are coming in, but the local authorities are being much, much more strict on the fact that they see these as automated passenger services. So from a regulatory standpoint and from a research perspective and R&D, the UK has always been like one of the ones to watch, especially if you look at human factors. Like the human factors research teams in the UK are some of the best ones out there. But when it's coming now to sort of operation and delivery, the EU are really starting to catch up on slightly more complex trials and sort of expanding beyond that.
Yeah.
Just to follow that question
Yeah.
about the rest of the world.
Oh yeah, sorry. Very Western perspective. I don't know as much around the rest of the world, but we are seeing in Singapore, for instance, there's a lot that tends to be more airside and portside. So Changi Airport, for instance, are using a lot of automated technologies on the airport side of things. So dollies, movement of baggages and so on. They've really been focused on closed sites far more than in on shared open roads. Japan, an interesting one. Japan is going to be the next sort of battleground-ish, but Japan are very much focused more on the vehicle design and then looking at partners who do the end-to-end, the stack, the digital side of things, and then integrating that within their vehicles. So there's a lot of stuff happening around Japan at the moment. And then obviously China, who are... Pony AI is probably the biggest one coming out of China at the moment, who is actually also, but they're really interested in coming to play in Europe because that's where they see the sort of initial deployments. So yeah, there's a lot of work going on across Asia, but I'm not as familiar with that one there as I am with Europe. So yeah. Australia, sorry, Australia, not so much. There's not that much there. New Zealand actually are sort of exporting a lot of their incredible talent. So Alex Kendall, CEO of Wave, I don't know if how familiar some of you are with the different organisations, but has come from an Omeo, who is one of the other vehicle developers actually who are out of Auckland, are currently doing a lot of work across some of the US in sort of small shuttle trials and a lot of work in Milton Keynes at the moment as well. So there's not as much happening there in terms of deployments, but there is work going on there, but it tends to be exported internationally from a deployment perspective. Yeah.
Yes. And then, so, yes, please. And then.
You know, apart from improving the quality of life and practicality of what you've said,
Yeah.
is there an economic advantage for, you know, like China and Japan and whatever, to start on the technology? I know you focused on the other side of it.
Yeah.
But are there going to be money made from this? Because for them to invest the money to get the technology, you know, I mean, does it look as though it's going to be an economic advantage?
So in terms of skills, jobs, employment, those things there is current modelling. Again, it's predominantly looked at from the work that I've been involved as I've looked at it more from an EU perspective around the economic benefits of, in terms of sector size, there is quite strong evidence around the potential impacts, particularly if we look at reskilling. And the fact that in existing transport services there is a global shortage of drivers, for instance, so actually there's a lot of benefit from that aspect there. Again, I can't speak too much around Asia because I'm not as familiar with the sort of perspective, and I don't want to say anything that would be wrong, but there is evidence from a broader sort of economic standpoint around the potential for these sectors, particularly if you start looking at the whole of the supply chain, and that's where it becomes really interesting, which is these solutions, and like some of the ones I talked about from the point, they have really complex technical aspects to them. And so that, the whole of the supply chain that comes with it from parts and so on and so forth, that's where people really see the value. And currently the UK is trying to see how it can keep as much of the supply chain in the UK as possible. The reality is I don't think that's going to be feasible when we look at the current way that the markets work at the moment. So yeah, that's the most confident information I can give you. Beyond that, I wouldn't want to say something that's based on just assumptions. So yeah.
Do you think the requirements associated with less able, nervous passengers can realistically be solved by technology, certainly in the short to medium term? The danger with automation, we're going to discriminate more against this cohort.
Yeah, that's a really, really real risk at the moment, is that because of the removal of the driver, actually we are introducing greater barriers to use. And I don't just mean that in terms of the physical and digital accessibility of the vehicles, but in terms of comfort and perceptions of safety in general, particularly when we look at the extent to which the current transport system is inaccessible. If we don't find those solutions, we're actually worsening a lot of those barriers. So it is a really, really massive risk at the moment, and it's one of the reasons why in that automated passenger service licensing form there is a requirement in there to evidence how it is. So I think the wording is the wording that's written in the current regulation is evidence of how it is improving an understanding of how to improve access to transport. Because the realization at the moment is that these are trials, they're very small scale vehicles, and actually a number of the services that are run in the first instance, even if they're improving the barriers that are reducing the barriers today, they may not be solving those barriers entirely. So there is a need to demonstrate a continuous improvement of how those user requirements are being understood and then met. And if they are not met satisfactorily, there is a potential to remove that license. And that's what the kind of core hook is, to ensure that that is being built into the design of the system. It's a hook with a number of limitations. If we look at, for instance, the fact that at the moment the Equality Act says, within reasonable adjustments and the interpretation of that. But it is the way, at the moment, it's a lot stronger than what we currently have in a lot of transport services. The fact that that license can be revoked if there's not evidence of ensuring accessibility, of improving knowledge of transport services. There's also the potential, and this is when the local authorities have a really important role to play. They can set their own criteria on top of what is required at the sort of that level. So if they could actually say that if it actively worsens the accessibility of transport, or if it's not providing a solution or an alternative, they could actually choose not to approve that license. So the local authorities currently have quite a lot of power at the moment, which I don't necessarily know if they're aware of. But yeah, it's quite a powerful tool there.
I mean, I was going to ask a question the gentleman I was
Yeah.
going to ask now, without, it shouldn't sound like a Luddite, it sounds a bit like a solutions technology, what's the problem?
Yeah. Yeah.
Those requirements are great for the current transport system in the short to medium term, let alone when it's automated.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the reality is that if the current transport system is used as the example of best practice, we've kind of failed, because the current transport system doesn't work. So it has to be that it is actively addressing those user requirements right from the start. And what we're seeing is, because currently everything's only ever been a trial, it's only been funded by R&D, there's always been an end date to it. A lot of those learnings have then been dependent on funding for a future project to be able to operate based on the current code of practice and the trial requirements. So now it will be interesting to see whether or not with the passenger services, but that ability to determine if the service is not accessible enough that it won't be allowed to operate, whether actually it provides an opportunity for different types of vehicles and devices to be introduced into the market that hadn't previously been able to, which is what some of the operators of novel vehicle types are sort of looking at, which is smaller scale services that are much more localized, that address a specific problem, as opposed to, but don't have to rely on government R&D to be able to deploy that. So yeah, of course.
I'll take one last question.
So you mentioned there was a report that said it's already worse for accessibility than in 2018.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So back into about a year ago, the Transport Select Committee did a review of, so they have a number of documentations and projects that they run. The first one was around transport accessibility, and there was a few reasons for that. Firstly, the National Centre for Accessible Transport, which is an evidence centre, had highlighted the sort of the sustained transport accessibility gap and how it hadn't been reduced. Tammy Gray-Thompson sits on that and chairs the Inclusive Transport Policy Commission. And so that was the topic that was chosen as that first Transport Select area of focus. And what that did was go and look at the evidence that is available nationally, but also regionally, around transport accessibility, number of journeys that were being made, experiences of those journeys, number of frequency of barriers. And what it found was that actually when you look at the comparisons between 2018, which is when the Inclusive Transport Strategy was published, and 2024, which would have been when the data, the evidence for that and the consultation that went on around that the transport accessibility gap had actually worsened. By that I mean the number of journeys that were being able to be made, the types and range of impacts, and as well as the impacts, the strength of impact of those barriers had worsened as a result of, and often driven by, inaccessible transport infrastructure, cuts to public transport services, lack of sort of integration across different services, which was also what led to the very recently published integrated transport strategy, which was all around that connectivity and sort of better integration of end-to-end journeys. So yeah, It's a really interesting report. It's on the gov.uk website. Highly recommend anyone who's interested in that to go and have a read through that, and the sort of commitments and requirements. A lot of it was also blamed on COVID and the extent to which obviously public sector funding had reduced on broader infrastructure projects, and therefore why there hadn't been that pace of change, which is obviously a very, very valid reason, but there was more to it than that in terms of cuts to services more generally.
So does your funding actually come down to cuts?
It comes down to a few things. It comes down to cuts in some aspects. It comes down to changes in how powers across administration. So obviously now there's a, sorry, we'll give that a go and see if that works. So yeah, reduction in terms of the powers that local authority had over transport service provisions, redrawing of lines around like, sorry. I really don't get that emotional about transport accessibility. But yeah, so cuts to changes to the way that R&D and allocation of funding had been done. The way that budget allocation is often done around infrastructure as well. Can I have a bit more water, Dad? Thank you. A bit more changes in how allocation of funding is done around maintenance of infrastructure, for instance, as well, was a really interesting one. That budgets for maintenance of road infrastructure tend to be all lumped together, and so that often means that everything is put on the carriageway with a reduction in quality around maintenance of footways and pedestrian infrastructure. So it's not just budget cuts, there was a lot more to that, but that was one of the core aspects within that, was cuts to funding around transport as a whole, and as well reduced quality of service in like transport operators, a lack of sticks, I guess, in terms of levers, particularly around delivery of quality of service on rail infrastructure as well, was another big one. So yeah, a good, it's never as easy as just funding cuts, but that was part of one of the reasons that we saw that, and a lack of kind of use of transport technology to sort of address some of the solutions that were, the barriers that were experienced. So yeah, of course, got there in the end.
Rebecca seems to be losing her voice. Thank you. As a thank you, we your little certificate.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you very much
for having been here, and a little
gadget. Oh, delightful! Thank you. I love a gadget. Oh, amazing! Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for attending.